So I saw a headline, a couple of, it's already going back 2 months now, relating to the show Curb Your Enthusiasm. Don't know if anyone here has seen it, watched it, heard of it. For those who have seen it and watched it regularly, I'm not in that category. I am a very big Seinfeld fan and know pretty much the entire series by heart. But when it comes to Curbed, was not a early watcher. Seen a couple of episodes. Of course, Larry David is a familiar character from his Seinfeld involvement. A little known trivia fact that sometimes when there are characters or voices that are not connected to a face in the Seinfeld show, it's Larry David. So if anyone remembers the character of George Steinbrenner in Seinfeld, and you hear the voice, that's Larry David's voice. So you can now use that fact when you play Seinfeld trivia. But in any event, of course, Seinfeld, Larry David, Jewish comedians. I figure this is a good week with so much heavy news in the headlines and scary things going on. We can lighten it up a little bit, and it was a good opportunity to use this topic. And Judaism is often part of the material of Jewish comedians, and people, when they see Larry David's comedy, immediately your first thing you think is a Jewish guy. Sounds Jewish, talks Jewish, maybe looks Jewish, and the like. But a couple of months ago, there was an episode in which the subject was that Larry David stained clothing belonging to someone. He stained a Klansman's robe, a member of the KKK's robe, and now he has to pay for it. And this somehow grabbed the attention of some of the Jewish culture watchers out there. You see source number one, which was an article in the foreword. What does the Talmud say about Larry David spilling coffee on a Klansman's robe? And so that caught my attention and led to looking into some of the Jewish plot lines within the story. Let's take a look at that in this case in particular. The fact that Judaism has its own vast corpus of legal arguments is of little interest to Larry David. He's a law unto himself. But every so often, his actions give way to a question of Talmudic precedent. When, for instance, Larry accidentally spilled coffee on a Klansman's robe on Sunday's episode, and then promised to have it laundered in time for 2 upcoming hate rallies in Tucson and Santa Fe, he stumbled into an area well trodden by commentators and scholars: property law. Throughout the episode, Larry explains how he feels obligated to pay for this white supremacist dry cleaning, even convincing a Jewish dry cleaner to do it, telling them, a la Jesus, that he's deciding to turn the other cheek. So before going further in the article, this is property law. Damages. You do something, you ding someone's car, you stain someone's clothes. In general, you have to pay for it. But what about the subtext of the fact that in this case, the clothing is going to be utilized for someone who's going to do something that's not so right with it? A hate rally. How does that play from a Jewish perspective? Is it some free speech and the like? So it's in a certain sense a very nice combination of comedy and Jewish law and Jewish thinking. So in this case, there was a couple of rabbinic responses from 2 individuals who I know pretty well. First is, halacha is pretty clear, said Rabbi Mark Wilds, the founder of Manhattan Jewish Experience, an attorney and a self-described curb fanatic. Rabbi Wilds, someone who has I've known for many, many years now from the west side of Manhattan. MJ is a terrific program. Rabbi Wilds has been out to Atlantic Beach and has spoken and taught here. So if you are negligent or you intentionally or carelessly damage someone else's property, whether it's your ox goring another ox from the Talmud, or your car smashes into someone else, or you spill coffee on someone else's clothing, you do have a responsibility to make the person whole, which means you need to take the item, get it cleaned, or pay for what that cost is. All right, we'll look at a couple of sources in a moment. Wild said that if the clothing in question is being used for sinful activity, and the Klansman makes it plenty clear that the kind of activity he has in mind, the person who damaged it is not responsible for cleaning it. In fact, it may be a problem to do so. You may be facilitating the sin by having the garment cleaned. Maybe there's an argument to be made about finding coats from other clansmen and spilling coffee on them while it's concluded. That actually might constitute a mitzvah. Okay. The idea, if you facilitate it now, if you clean the clansman's robe that he then gets to go to this rally, that's a sin. There's a category in Jewish law of Misayeya Yedei Avera, that you are helping the hands of someone commit a sin. All right, so that's Rabbi Weil's approach. Next is Chaim Saiman, the chair of Jewish law at Villanova University, also someone I've known for many years. He was my roommate in yeshiva in Israel after high school. Was less sure that the nature of the garment soiled or the guy holding it changed the basic facts of the damage done. You probably owe him the amount of dry cleaning, Saiman said, though we acknowledge your considerations about aiding someone doing something illicit. Jewish law might say the fact this guy is a Klansman probably doesn't excuse you from liability, but it certainly wouldn't say don't go out of your way to facilitate the illicit action, Saiman said. The idea that, look, when it comes to freedom of speech, what is the level of sin of hateful speech, and is that a sin that you have to try and prevent? All right, look, in a world where those who are confronting modernity can look for these types of issues and the Jewish approach to these issues, it makes for an interesting story. It makes for some humor. But what are some of the sources involved? And I think that Rabbi Weil's raised the issue of paying for damages. Chaim Saiman also raises the issue of making the person whole. You probably have to pay for what you damage. However, one of the issues that we could address halachically from this episode or from this issue, what is the Jewish responsibility towards the non-Jew? Right. Very often we talk about property law, we talk about damages, we talk about other areas of civil law. Most of the time, halacha is written with the direction of the Jew towards the Jew. Halacha really wasn't written with regards to the Jew living with the non-Jew. And therefore, it is Mishnah in Bava Kama, source number 2, really presents where this issue is meant to be understood. With regard to an ox of a Jew that gored the ox of a Gentile, right? This is the classic cases of damages that are presented in the Talmud in the fourth order of the Mishnah, Nezikin, and the famous Bavas, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra. Bava is a gate. So there are 3 gates of Jewish jurisprudence and civil law. So if the Jewish ox of a Jew gores the ox of a Gentile, the owner of the belligerent ox is exempt from liability. Right? You don't have to pay. But with regard to an ox of a Gentile that gored the ox of a Jew, regardless of whether the goring ox was innocuous or forewarned, the owner of the ox pays the full cost of the damage. So the Jew is not responsible for damaging the non-Jew's ox, but the non-Jew is responsible for damaging the Jewish ox. That's the way the Mishnah presents it. Now, as is often the case in the Mishnah, it's not the final word on the matter. The Mishnah presents the law, and then the Gemara goes into a discussion, right? That's why the rabbis of the Gemara are called Amoraim. Amoraim from the Hebrew word of Omer, which means to speak. So there's a law presented, and then the Jews talk about it a lot, and that's what the Gemara is there for. And the Gemara raises the issue that this doesn't seem fair. Why should the Jew be exempt, but the non-Jew have to pay? And so the Talmud goes into a discussion. On some level, the conclusion isn't to reverse the teaching of the Mishnah, but the rabbis in the Gemara seem to analyze the fact that, no, the reason that we're dealing with a situation with a non-Jew who's not following the 7 Noahide laws. We're dealing with someone who is not properly adhering to their responsibilities. And therefore, that person is denied compensation because they're outside of the category for deserving compensation. And that's why you don't pay the non-Jew in this case. But if it was a law-abiding non-Jewish citizen, that might be a different case. This, of course, opens up a whole Pandora's box of who's a law-abiding non-Jewish citizen and who's not. Suffice it to say, this is a larger issue from a Jewish perspective also. There's the expression, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," which we all know is a source of the mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael, loving a fellow Jew. The word reacha is understood and analyzed by the Talmudic sages as reacha. Who is reacha? Do you have to love everybody? Maybe Reyacha is a Jew who's behaving properly. If a Jew's not behaving properly, you don't have to necessarily treat the person with the same level of care and concern, right? Certain people are inside the camp, certain people are outside the camp. We have that issue when it comes to Jews. So certainly we'll have that issue when it comes to non-Jews as well. And that opens up a whole conversation. Who's in the camp, who's outside the camp. We actually will come back to that with another Curb Your Enthusiasm episode at the end. But in this case, with regards to damaging the property of a non-Jew, it is very possible that there's no responsibility to repay because you're damaging, it belongs to a non-Jew, you don't have to pay. If you damage the cloak of if you stain the clothing of a Jew, you have to pay. Now, this is might be the letter of the law, but there's another rabbinic approach to this issue, and it's mentioned in the Talmud under different categories, different names. One is called Ava. Ava, not the woman's name Ava, but Ava is spelled Aleph Yud Bet Hey. It has to do with hatred. Now, according to the letter of the law, you may be exempt from compensation or paying for damages. However, what's going to happen? You're not going to pay for the damages. That person is going to get angry, and there may be consequences. There may be consequences to you. There may be consequences to the entire Jewish community, right? Plenty of bad things happen. Plenty of bad things can happen just by looking funny at someone in eliciting their anger and the like. And so the rabbis were often very concerned as to how Jewish behavior, according to the letter of the law, what the repercussions of that would be. And it opens up the fact that the rabbis, even though the letter of the law, remember, the Torah gives us the commandments, and the letter of the law may state one thing, we're always open to the idea of extrajudicial conclusions. The idea of being open to, you have to go beyond the letter of the law. We see this in all sorts of different areas, including in cases where the Talmud in Sanhedrin talks about this idea that if two people have a disagreement and they bring it to the rabbinical court for adjudication, they open up the possibility that, look, if they would prefer that the cases the individuals settle and come to an agreement rather than having to inflict the letter of the law in a certain case, so that there be someone who wins and someone who loses. Because if that happens, someone's going to be upset. Right, and you can't make everyone happy all the time, but maybe there's a way to cushion or soften the blow in certain cases. So it's a fascinating subject, this idea of going what's called lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond what the lines of the law say. Let's sometimes be open to moving beyond. And this has ramifications in terms of sometimes making the final verdict a little bit easier to swallow. Also, in many ways, we see this at play when imposing justice. Just as an example, then we'll look at this case in particular, with regards, for example, the death penalty in Jewish law. Torah believes in a death penalty. It says time and time again, perpetrator shall die. The rabbis got a hold of this and they twisted it and turned it and raised the threshold, the burden of proof so high that they almost never imposed a death penalty. So we have what the law says, we have how the law is applied, and this is an important distinction, an important opportunity to recognize that we validate the law, but are often willing to go beyond it to find a resolution that will play out well in the human realm to the best possible conclusion. And so an example of this sentiment, which as it may be applied in particular to repaying the damages towards a non-Jew, Seder Eliyahu Rabbah, a Midrashic collection, source number 3, make the name of heaven beloved by human beings. Do this by the way in which you conduct your business in the marketplace with others, so that they will say, fortunate is so-and-so who has studied Torah. See how pleasant are his deeds, how lovely his ways. Let us too learn Torah and teach it to our children. Thus it has been said, one should distance himself from stealing from non-Jews and Jews, from anyone in the market. For if one begins by stealing from non-Jews, he'll eventually steal from Jews as well. If he spills the blood of a non-Jew, eventually he'll shed that of a Jew as well. The Torah is not given for that, but in order to sanctify God's great name. And you shall proclaim my greatness among the nations. Right? The idea of, yes, there's a letter of the law, but there's also the idea of there's also the impact that adherence to the law is supposed to have upon everyone, Jew and non-Jew alike. And so that you may be technically exempt from repaying the damages, but you have to put that into perspective, into the overall picture of how this will lead people to respond to how Jews are acting, which could have technical negative repercussions, or it just does not create an environment where people will think kindly towards Jews, and it can even impact negatively and adversely Jewish connection to the practice of Judaism. So in this case in particular, while the initial response would be you stain someone's garment, even if it's a Klansman's robe, you pay for the cleaning. It is actually a little bit more of a complicated issue, which gets into the how Jewish law applies to our relationship with non-Jews in general. And in this case, the conclusion may end up being the same, but there's a process that we look at technically the letter of the law as it applies between Jew and non-Jew, and then in the larger issue of living a Judaism that will be viewed in a positive light and inspire both Jew and non-Jew. Any questions or comments on this first springboard issue before we take it to a couple more episodes?
Rabbi,
Yes.
would you say that common sense should be the ruling guide?
So I would say common sense is important, but what I think what the Torah is trying to present us with is there is a foundation of Torah, divine law, tradition, rabbinical law, upon which we base all of our actions. And at times our actions are guided not only by the foundation, but a practicality and an applicability to all situations. Just to maybe digress for a moment, and this is something that was referenced in source number 3 in terms of sometimes going beyond the letter of the law and our interactions with non-Jews. According to Jewish law, you violate Shabbat to save a life. Now, according to the strict letter of the law, you only violate Shabbat to save a Jewish life. You don't violate Shabbat to save a non-Jewish life. That's the strict letter of the law. It's explicit in the Talmud. What's also explicit in the Talmud is that if that will lead to negative repercussions, like we said before, Ava, there'll be hostility, hatred towards Jews, because if Jews don't save non-Jews, then non-Jews won't save Jews. Well, if that's the case, then you're actually, by saving a non-Jewish life, you're saving a Jewish life, because if we want the non-Jews to save Jews, we have to save non-Jews. So from a tactical and a practical perspective, at the end of the day, we don't differentiate, right? In general, you violate Shabbat to save a life, period. You don't find out who's Jewish, who's not Jewish. And you can have conversations. How do you know who's Jewish? If most people are Jewish, or some people are Jewish, trust me, if you have those questions, the Talmud and the codes dig deeply into this issue. And so, for many, this sounds terrible. Why should we ever presume that, imagine the scenario, right? If the Talmud really says we save Jews save non-Jews on Shabbat for utilitarian or practicality, well, you can create a scenario. You're in a place where it's only one Jew and one non-Jew, stranded on a desert island, and the non-Jews it needs to be rescued on Shabbat by violating Shabbat. And no one will know whether the Jew stood by and did nothing or not. And so there's no repercussions. In that type of a scenario, would we say the Jew should let the non-Jew die and not violate Shabbat to save the Jew? Now, if you wanted to go strict letter of the law, applying the sources as written, let the non-Jew die, which would, again, you have to be sure that the word will never get out, which in and of itself sounds a little bit strange. So this issue, was addressed throughout history, and especially in more modern times where the relationship between Jew and non-Jew has changed. And we've spoken about that before. There was a time when there was no relationship between Jew and non-Jew. The whole idea of a Jew being in proximity to a non-Jew for anything other than the non-Jew doing bad to the Jew was completely hypothetical. It never existed. It didn't happen. There was no interaction. And so as that changed throughout history, the way that this law was examined also changed. And so, for example, Rabbi Zion Chai Uziel, one of the chief rabbis of Israel in the 1950s, started looking at the situation from a perspective of, for lack of any other term, evolution. Right? The evolution of our attitude towards a non-Jew has changed so that we won't look at this as a b'di'evet, as something of something that is after the fact. We won't look at it as something, oh, well, I shouldn't have to save the non-Jew, but I will because they'll take revenge. No, over time, our relationship, our attitude towards non-Jews have changed. That no, instead of this being utilitarian about what the relation between the Jew and the non-Jew will be, it becomes, we now have a different way of looking at all human life, and therefore don't ask any questions. Anyone's in trouble, just save the person, irregardless of what is their religion or nationality. And I think that even though many of us would say, of course, that's obvious, and kind of dismiss all of the past back and forth legalistics on the subject, I think it's important to recognize that how we approach the question today is built upon the traditional original sources of Torah and Talmud. And I think that's what makes Judaism so beautiful and so complex. So I think common sense built upon how we approach the world around us today definitely shapes it, our response, but it's built upon the tradition of Judaism. That's what makes it unique, because otherwise common sense is not based on any type of spiritual, existential, divine type of foundation. And we believe in all of that and common sense. So I would say common sense is in the mix, but it's not the exclusive determinant.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I have to interject. Please forgive me that you used a word that hit a sore point with me. Irregardless is not in the dictionary.
You're right.
The word is regardless.
Thank you very much. See, that's why I used it. I was hoping, because you are my vocab coach. So thank you.
I want you to know that I'm listening, Rabbi.
That's, just like I will be listening to your Haftorah,
Okay.
commemorating the 80th anniversary of your bar mitzvah on Shabbos. So
Thank you, Rabbi.
we
Thank
listen to each other. All
Thank
right.
you, Rabbi.
So, so once this episode caught the attention of Jewish culturati out there, there were some other episodes which were identified. So Andrew Silo Carroll, writing in the JTA, source number 4, right? Larry David has never been shy about surfacing and lampooning Judaism and Jewishness. He has contemplated the dilemmas of Holocaust survival, waded into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and gotten stranded on a ski lift with an Orthodox Jew on Shabbat. So there you have the link to this episode on the source sheet. It is very funny. I have, beware, some of the language is spicy. Can't help that. But basically you have Larry David on a ski lift with a woman who talks and looks like an observant woman. And the ski lift stopped and she's very nervous. What is she worried about? She's worried about Shkias Hachama, which is the setting of the sun. And she uses that term, Shkias Hachama. And she says it with the ches and with the Ashkenazis pronunciation. She's very worried about the Sabbath. And she's also very worried about her concern on the show. I'm not sure she gets it right 100% halachically, is being stuck when Shabbos starts with a man alone at a stop ski lift. And so ultimately, she jumps down to the snow, obviously not to her death, but it's a little bit of a dicey situation. And it's, obviously it catches Larry off guard, and it's, what's going on here that she can't stay on the ski lift. So there actually would seem to be the two halachic issues she's concerned with is 1, Shabbos, and 2, she's concerned about yichud. Yichud is about a man and a woman being alone in a secluded place. So lest you think this is just made up by the writers of Larry David, there was a case in the 1960s. Source number 5 is the AP report, as mentioned in the New York Times. You could find it online. You can't find the text online. They actually have like the proofs of the copies of the articles there. Jewish law cited by girl for leap off stuck ski lift. Jewish girl from Brooklyn jumped 25 feet from a chairlift at a ski area rather than disobey a dictate of her religion and sit stranded through the night with a male escort, according to the court testimony discussed today. The dilemma that Ruth Friedman said she faced in 1963 when she was 16 unfolded in the appellate division of state Supreme Court. Here, as the state sought to recover damages awarded to her by a lower court, the state was required to pay $35,000 for injuries and $22,331 to her father for medical expenses. In the court of claims, the girl, now Mrs. Friedman Eider, testified that her Hebrew religious training motivated her action. Both she and the rabbi attested to the religious law, which says an unmarried girl cannot remain with a male in a place not accessible to a third person. Spokesman for the Jewish Theological Academy said last night that there are several references in the Talmud to such a prohibition, although he added that the circumstances governing its application were a matter of rabbinical debate. So it was an episode of Curbed, but it was actually a story. And you could find the decision of the court online. And so what's going on? What are some of the halachic issues? So let's talk a couple sources about yichud, and then also what about the issue of being stuck on a ski lift, being on a ski lift on Shabbos? And I think that for both accounts, both Friedman and the woman in Curb did not have to jump. I'm sure it was much funnier in the show than it was for Ruth Friedman herself, who suffered a broken ankle and some lacerations. So this idea of yichud is part of the concern of trying to avoid any types of situations which could lead to, improper sexual interaction. We're not just talking about relations, but improper interaction among between the sexes, and therefore we have kind of warning lights always throughout rabbinic literature. Sometimes they seem a little bit more extreme, like in Pirkei Avot, about avoid talking too much to a woman because ultimately you'll inherit Gehenna, which makes it sound like you talk too much to women, you go straight to hell. There is concern as to what being too close to someone of the opposite gender can lead to. Source number 6 is kind of a summary of this attitude. The rabbi said, a man should not be alone with any woman in an inn, even with his sister or his daughter, because of what people will think. He should not chat with a woman in the marketplace, even with his own wife, let alone with another woman, because of what people will claim. Do not come near something that causes you to sin. Stay away from ugliness, and even something similar to ugliness, right? You have to be very careful. But, in more recent times, we have encountered all types of situations of people behaving badly, situations where, really terrible things took place, in terms of sexual abuse and molestation. Bad things happen. Not to say that all these rules are a panacea, but the idea, you have to beware, and that was definitely an attitude that the rabbis had in the mingling of the sexes. How does this become applied in different situations? Should there be mixed seating at weddings and the like? These are all extensions of the conversation of how we want to be careful to avoid any type of impropriety or even the appearance of impropriety. So, you could say, then maybe don't get on a ski lift in the first place with the person of the opposite sex, could be, but in general, you want to avoid this. So one of these things is yichud, which is coming into contact in seclusion, a man and a woman who are not related. And this actually leads to all types of situations. So it talks about being careful even with a sister or daughter. Just an example from Jewish law, that this issue actually gets raised with a couple who have an adopted daughter, let's say, and what's the proper behavior between the father and his adopted daughter? Because technically, according to Jewish law, there's no biological relation. It's not his daughter. It's the girl that he's raising, but it's not his daughter. And this is actually something that is discussed, and there's disagreements about whether or not the adopted father can be alone with his daughter once she hits a certain age without leading to this concern. It seems to take this further to the extreme, but that is where this concern goes. That's where the topic of yichud can take us. And as in many cases, there's a machlokes. Some authorities rule that obviously they can be together alone because it may not be his biological daughter, but it's his daughter. And some say absolutely not. And you have to strictly apply the laws of yichud, of not secluding a man and a woman together. However, with regard to this situation, on a ski lift, the Shulchan Aruch clearly points out a house whose door is open to the public domain, there is no concern for seclusion, with a woman with whom sexual relations are forbidden, right? I would think that a ski lift is more of a public space where others can come in. They talk about being alone in a place that has a door unlocked, would be permissible. So I think there's definitely room to not invoke yichud and not jump if you're stuck on the ski lift for that type of a situation. What about the ski lift in general from a Shabbos perspective? So when we talk about Shabbos, there's problematic of operating something that is mechanical, but what about something that is mechanical that is operating without your involvement, right? The ski lift is going around up and down, and you really have nothing to do with its operation. You just get on and get off. So it could be similar to an escalator. Rabbi Chaim Jachter in source number 8, just a couple of lines from a very thorough halachic text analysis. There is one area where it seems that one may be lenient, the use of automatic escalators on Shabbat. Rav Neuwirth permits the use of automatic escalators on Shabbat. This ruling is of great significance in communities such as Hong Kong, where it's very difficult to get from one section of the city to another without using escalators. I think that a ski lift is very much like an escalator. It's operating, it gets stuck, but then if it gets stuck because something mechanically is wrong, they're not fixing it for you. And once it starts, it's continuing its operation. Now, should you go on a ski lift on Shabbos? Should it be close to Shabbos? I think like as we discussed with regards to winter sports and ice skating last week, it may not be the best place to be on Shabbos, but I think from a halachic perspective, like escalators, ski lifts are permissible to be out on Shabbos. So if we get stuck, I don't think anyone has to jump because of Shabbos. I don't think anyone has to jump if they're sitting next to someone of the opposite gender. And I hope that Ruth Friedman recovered from her injuries and that people did enjoy the episode of Curb. Questions or comments, reactions to this second halacha from Curb Your Enthusiasm?
Rabbi,
Yes.
avoiding temptation is a golden rule, an important common sense rule that goes back to Eve, Adam and Eve.
Look, it's wonderful that Torah very much has a lot of common sense. At the same time, there will be situations that don't seem to be as much sensible or make as common
I'm
sensical.
on Zoom. What is it?
But we follow them anyway. So I think that if it sounds commonsensical, great. I don't know if commonsensical is a word. Sounds good enough. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but in this situation, I think it's important to note that there's a whole halachic backstory to analyze. What is the status of a ski lift on Shabbos? Just like we don't turn on lights on Shabbos, and we don't drive on Shabbos, and we don't operate machinery on Shabbos. But what about machinery that's operating for us on Shabbos? And what about the fact that we use timers? These are all interconnecting situations. Within Jewish law, you'll have different opinions. Some of you may be familiar with elevators, what they call a Shabbos elevator. Some people feel elevators are not a problem at all as long as you don't operate it. If you want to get more technical and scientific, if you get in an elevator, does your weight contribute to the elevator having to use more electricity, and is that problematic? My understanding from those who are in the engineering trade is that actually elevators were always set to go up at their highest weight capacity. So the more people in an elevator, it does not work harder to go up, but it does actually have to apply braking when it goes down. So it could be that elevators are more problematic going down than going up. There are all sorts of directions to go within Jewish law, but it is, here, while we're talking about the serious stuff, we have a little bit of a smile on our face that some of these issues are coming up in a comedy. So let's look at one other episode, and we'll look at two more examples. This also was mentioned in Andrew Silo Carroll's article, source number 9. The latest episode, for example, A Jew for Jesus joins the cast of the show. Larry's character is developing for Hulu. Although neither Larry nor his Jewish friends are remotely religious, they seem genuinely upset by the actor's apostasy. Larry gives him a rather sober warning that he shouldn't proselytize on set. All right, so we have Jews for Jesus on Curbed. So what is the status of someone who is a Jew for Jesus? What is it? Generally, Jew for Jesus is someone who identifies as Jewish, but believes in Jesus as the Messiah. So on the one hand, Talmudic rabbinic Judaism is very forgiving. Source number 10. Israel has sinned is the verse in Joshua. Rabbi Abba, son of Zavda, said, even though a Jew has sinned, they are still considered a Jew. So are you Jewish no matter what? Doesn't matter how badly a Jew sins, they're always Jewish. So, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein analyzed the situation. There was a case in Israel in the 1960s, a case of a brother Daniel, who had been born Jewish and then became a monk and was in Israel and wanted to stay using the law of return because his parents were Jewish. So he qualifies to make Aliyah under the law of return, even though he was not living his life as a Jew. And it was a discussion in Israel, especially, we talk about who is a Jew very often these days. And this is something that, is in the Israeli press as they try and deal with laws and policies towards conversion in Israel, because there's several 100,000 Jews from the former Soviet Union who identify as Jews, many of them, especially the younger generation, serving in the army, speaking Hebrew, the only religion they know is Jews, but they're not, their parents aren't Jewish, and they're not Jewish. So here you have plenty of Jews living as Jews who aren't Jewish, and here is someone who's born Jewish but not living as a Jew. What's their status? So we talked about this last year when they discovered in Israel that there was a rabbi who had turned out was really proselytizing. Wasn't clear if he was halachically Jewish or not, or whether he was just pretending to be Jewish. But for our purposes now, this is Rabbi Lichtenstein's analysis of Brother Daniel. Source number 11, there is an apostasy not of action, but of person. An estrangement manifested not merely by the commission of various sins, but by the complete severance of personal bonds with Jewry, by total alienation from the Jewish people and its history as a spiritual and physical community, and finally, by thorough assimilation into the mainstream Gentile society. There is then a point beyond which the apostate cannot go and yet remain a Jew. The account can be overdrawn and the rubber band can burst. If we ask in purely descriptive terms whether anyone born of Jewish parents is a Jew, the answer must be yes. As an epithet, the term Jew remains applicable to any individual who was ever endowed with Jewish status, even to an apostate. However, if we ask whether the Meshumad has anything of a Jewish personality and character, and whether therefore he continues to be endowed with the personal status of a Jew, the answer is a ringing no. He remains a Jew without Jewishness. That's how Rabbi Lichtenstein describes it, right? You're always a Jew, but you're sometimes a Jew without Jewishness. And so, that could be why this idea of Jews for Jesus has such a visceral negative reaction, because we can forgive a lot of sinful activity, behavior, but when it comes to define the very essence of a Jew, well, the very essence of a Jew means to the exclusion of recognizing any role for Jesus, and that is why it stands out. And so even those assimilated Jews in Curb Your Enthusiasm really have a negative view of a Jew for Jesus. Source number 12 just mentions a couple of practical standards that were applied within the conservative movement if Messianic Jews want to be part of the synagogue. Right? The conservative movement, as opposed to the Orthodox movement, has a much more centralized body for bringing questions and presenting standards. And so you see that they don't want the Messianic Jew can't receive synagogue honors. They shouldn't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. And if they're questions, they have to be dealt with on an individual basis. But being a Messianic Jew can't deny or eliminate, or you can't reverse Jewish status, but you have a Jew without Jewishness. Questions or comments on this episode? Okay, So one final one that Andrew Silo Carroll mentions in his article, and also there's a link to you watching this clip as well. A week earlier, a member of his golf club, played by Rob Morrow, asked Larry to pray for his ailing father. Larry declined, saying his prayer is useless. He also wonders why God would need or heed the prayer of a random atheist like himself instead of the distressed son who wants his father to live. And then, this idea, he wants him to pray for my dad. Why should I pray for your dad? Who am I? What does my prayer help? So, when watching the clip, it's kind of just, it's like a very dismissive, non-religious Jew, not really interested in praying for someone else. Maybe, being felt that he's being put upon to be asked to even do the simple thing of say a mishabera for someone, which is, very simple activity. However, it does raise an interesting question about what's the nature of prayer. And, very often our understanding of prayer, I would say the more popular, the more accepted approaches, prayer is a mitzvah. It's a commandment, it's a religious activity, but it also, there's kind of a two-way street. We feel we're speaking and we know that God is listening. We say in the davening that God is shomea tefillah, God hears the prayer. Doesn't mean that the answers are always the ones that we want, right? That's the famous episode of people praying for someone to recover, and they organized days of prayer, and they all recited Tehillim, but the person passed away, and someone asked the rabbi, what happened? How come God didn't hear our prayers? And of course, the rabbi answered, very seriously, no, God heard the prayers, but he answered no. So we often look at prayer as a dynamic exchange. It's a religious obligation, but we're saying things that we hope are being heard, processed, and some level responded. For some people, it almost takes on the form of a candy machine. You put in the prayer, you get out the object. And prayer is sometimes built that way, right? We say prayer in the Shemona Esrei, grant us wisdom, please grant us wisdom. I know plenty of students in Jewish day schools who say that prayer with extra intensity on the day that they have a test. All right, God, you grant wisdom, so please grant us wisdom. Let me do well on the test. Now, on some level, whether to do well on the test or not is going to be determined not as much by the prayer, but whether they studied or not. And sometimes when you don't study that much is when you pray even harder. So it's kind of interesting that we use God to try and fill in the gaps of our own omissions. But we often look at prayer in this dynamic way. And I think that most people wouldn't see prayer as just purely a mechanical obligation. They view it as some kind of dynamic interaction that my prayers have the ability to affect something. So there's a philosopher, Israeli philosopher, Yeshayahu Leibowitz. He is the brother of the famed Torah teacher and scholar Nechama Leibowitz. He was a Jewish philosopher, observant, orthodox individual with some unorthodox approaches to things, including prayer. Source number 14, only the prayer which one prays as the observance of a mitzvah is religiously significant. The spontaneous prayer, when he's overwhelmed and pours out his complaint before God, a man prays of his own accord, is of course halachically permissible, but like the performance of any act which has not been prescribed, its religious value is limited. As a religious act, it is even faulty, since he who prays to satisfy his needs and sets himself up as an end, as though God were a means for promotion of his welfare. Right? Leibowitz is saying, you pray because it's a mitzvah to pray. You don't pray because you want something, you expect to get something. Who would have known that Larry David is a follower of Yeshayahu Leibowitz? Or the idea that the more humorous response that he has in this episode of why should I pray? What does God need my prayer? Does open up a conversation as to what is the nature of prayer. And we have this this view of Leibowitz, which is very rational and very halachic, although a little bit cold and not necessarily part of the mainstream, because we really want to feel our prayers do something. But Leibowitz is presenting a little bit more of a sterile approach. It's something that we have to do and is really not related to whether or not we expect to get something or have a religious experience from it. So I don't really think in the writer's room for Curb Your Enthusiasm, a lot of these halachic discussions or sources came up. But It was fun to research and to show a little bit of this interface between Larry David and some of these halachic issues. Some of the clips are funny as well, and hopefully we'll be able to, find the other topics of interest that can be serious, and also find some topics so we can smile when we teach as well. Happy to take any questions, comments, reactions.